Okay guys, so just as a little bit of review from yesterday, so iron weapons replaced bronze ones, which made it cheaper to own weapons and made ordinary people be able to fight in wars. And so what sort of happened in Sparta and Athens and other places in Greece is that they developed larger militaries, and for this larger military to work, they had to make these tactical formations of soldiers. So like the troops that we have, that there's a certain amount, they have a certain job, that's what these phalanxes were for. Because they spent so much time together doing long hours of drill, that training created a sense of unity among those soldiers and kind of reduced class differences in Sparta and Athens. And remember, we said Sparta was more military and disciplined, and Athens was that individualistic, intellectual kind of city. Alright, Sparta settled from the north. The slaves greatly outnumbered the actual number of citizens, so they set up a really strict regime to make sure that those slaves didn't get out of hand and take over Sparta. And the government consisted of 2 kings, a council of elders, and then an assembly of citizens that approved major decisions that the King's and Advisory Council had come up with. To be in the assembly, you had to be male, you had to be native Spartan, and you had to be over 30. Okay, so this is kind of where we left off yesterday. We talked about how sickly babies were abandoned, and that was because children were thought of as future soldiers and future mothers of soldiers in the case of girls, instead of children like we think of. So kind of the lifestyle of boys. At 7 years old, the boys were taken from their parents and they moved into military barracks. Their diets were changed, exercised rigidly, and were disciplined. And then, so to develop a sneakiness and a cunning, they were encouraged to steal food, but if they were caught, then they were beaten. So at 20 years old, Spartan boys could marry, but they still had to live in the barracks until age 30. And that was to kind of make sure that you were still getting the food that they wanted you to get, making sure that, you and your brothers were still in that sort of fighting mentality. And they had to eat at the barracks until they were 60, so they could leave the barracks to live with their wives and families at 30, but they had to eat at the barracks until they were 60. And like I said earlier, at age 30, males could be in the assembly. Okay, let's talk about girls in Sparta. So they too kind of had a life change at 7, but they were able to remain with their families. They just started school at that age. And they were expected to learn the same subjects as the boys, and that is unique to Sparta at this time period, because pretty much everywhere else, boys learn, math, science, all that good stuff, and girls learn a little bit of reading, and then the rest of it is taking care of children, taking care of their houses, all that good stuff, how to run a servant's household, all that sort of stuff. So the girls also had to be physically fit. They learned combat, they wrestled, and they did gymnastics with the boys. And that's super unique to Sparta. They're about the only civilization on Earth that was the case. And the thinking behind it was that healthy women made healthy children. And healthy children, at least half of them were going to be healthy boys and healthy fighters. So at the age of 18, both girls and boys would be tested for citizenship, and it was a mix of physical testing and mental testing, and you had to pass both in order to become a citizen. If you failed these tests, it meant that you became middle class, what they referred to as perioikos. So, you have your citizens, you have your perioikos, who are that middle class that failed their citizenship test and are kind of SOL for the rest of their life, and then you have sort of the slave class. Alright, so the culture of Sparta. Spartans did not like foreigners. They isolated themselves from other cities, And they didn't trade because to them material possessions were not priority. Their priority was to be the best fighter, to be the strongest, to be the fastest, to be the best. And pretty much travel to anywhere else was banned by the Spartan government unless you had a really good reason to leave, like military duty. So a Greek once said of Spartans that they are willing to die for their city because they have no reason to live. So basically what that quote means is, I think it was an Athenian who said it, what the Athenian meant by that is they're tricked into thinking they have a bunch of freedom. They're tricked into thinking that their lives are great, and they're willing to die for that. But the Athenians said, because they don't really have a life like an Athenian would have a life, that they are much more willing to die for that reason. Okay. So just to kind of go back over the social groups, the equals were the citizens, and these were the people who controlled the city-state. So if you were male and over 30, you would be in the assembly, and they were the ones who owned land and what they called helots, and helots were the slaves of the Spartans. So equals kind of run the place. Those half-citizens, they were free, so they weren't slaves. They paid taxes, but they had no political power. And this would be the perioikos, or foreigners that came in. They weren't citizens, really, but they still had to pay taxes. And then the helot class, or the slaves of the Spartans, that, like I said, outnumbered the Spartans. And this is some artwork from Sparta. And this just kind of shows you kind of what they valued. So, pretty much in all of these, they're doing some sort of fighting. So, in this one, it looks like they're boxing. In this one, I don't know, maybe wrestling. In this one, maybe wrestling again. And this one, they're sort of like sword fighting with each other. This was kind of their military uniform. They covered the important places, big old shield that weighed a ton, and then their helmet that's legendary. Alright, so that's Sparta. Let's talk about Athens a little bit. So before 700 BC, Athens kind of evolved from a monarchy, which is a city controlled by a king or queen, to an aristocracy. And an aristocracy is a country that's controlled by their nobility. So in 700 BC, landowners held the power. Landowners were the ones who chose officials and judged court cases. And if they hold all the power, then obviously they're going to want to sway those decisions in their favor. And so landowners' wealth and power grew, but ordinary people who didn't have land, they were super discontent. And these people who didn't own land were these merchants and soldiers, and they believed that they had more rights than they were getting. And another thing that kind of made people upset was that foreigners were barred from citizenship. So even if you moved to Athens when you were 4 years old, at the age of 50, you still wouldn't have citizenship because you weren't considered an Athenian. So because of this discontent, because of the discontentment of these quote-unquote lower-class people, there was a really slow move to democracy in Athens. And this is basically what Athens is known for, is their democracy, their creation of democracy. And that's a government by the people. Okay, so some reformers of Athens, kind of what shoved them along into democracy, were Draco, Solon, Pisistratus, and Cleisthenes. Alright, tough names, say them however you want. You're not really going to have to worry about spelling them. But this is some of the stuff that they did. Okay, so at the time of Draco, one of the reformers that we're talking about, there was a lot of unrest between the classes in Athens. So most of the people in Athens were poor, and they had very little power over their lives because they weren't allowed to really speak for themselves in politics. So this gap between the rich and the poor eventually led to a lot of conflict in Athens, and to help sort of calm that conflict and stop that unrest, Draco imposed super harsh punishments, and really they didn't do much except make things worse in Athens. Solon was appointed archon, which is I'm having a brain fart here. He was the chief official of Athens, and so he kind of revised the laws of Draco, sort of overturned the harshest ones, and outlawed debt slavery. So debt slavery is when you're so poor that you can't pay back your debt, so what they do is they make you a slave instead. So he outlawed that happening, and he tried to reduce poverty by encouraging trade. But the most significant change that Solon did was in Athens' government. So he gave high offices to more citizens, and he allowed all men in Athens to take part in the assembly that governed the city and to serve on the juries and that kind of stuff. But still, really only wealthy men could run or hold those political offices. But this was kind of the first real step towards democracy. But it was still a pretty limited democracy. So Solon's laws, in Athens, it's still, there was still a lot of unrest between the classes. And while his new laws and his new steps towards democracy relieved some of the tension in Athens, they didn't completely resolve it. And so in about 541 or so, Pisistratus, he seized power, and we call him a tyrant because he seized power by force and wasn't elected into that position. The thing about a tyrant is it sounds like a bad thing, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're a bad leader. It just means that they seized power by force. So maybe they were bad in the beginning, but it doesn't mean that they were a terrible leader. And so despite how kind of violent his rise to power was, he was still super popular with the people because he pushed those aristocrats out of office and created jobs by increasing trade, and pretty much made Athens richer, gave poor people more voice in Athens. So it was, he wasn't as terrible as you might think a tyrant could be. Alright, so after Pisistratus died, another reformer named Cleisthenes took over Athens, and this is really where we see the stage set for democracy in Athens and in the world. So what he did is he wanted to break up the power of noble families, and what he did was he divided Athens into tribes based on where people lived, and he made these tribes the basis for elections. So not families, not social groups, where people lived. And each tribe elected 50 men to serve on the Council of 500. And the Council of 500 were the people who supervised the government, prepared laws for the assemblies. They were the ones who led Athens into its democracy.